I see the arrow pointing at it.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, just wanted to make sure it was coming through properly. So good morning, everyone. Good evening if you're calling in from the United States. I see that we're getting our attendees joining us from the waiting room right now. So please, we're going to start in 2 minutes, but feel free to go into one of the translation rooms if you want to listen in one of the local Mekong languages, and otherwise hang tight and we'll get started very shortly.
Okay, ở đây con bỏ cái quạt hạt nhân tam Telegram. Xong tật sốt.
It's like someone is drawing on the screen.
Just trying to figure out who is annotating. But we've got, it looks like we've got about 100 people on the line right now. So Brian, I don't know if you want to go ahead and get started with some opening remarks. We'll probably still get some people trickling in over the next minute or two, but I think we're starting to see a slowdown there.
Excellent. Why don't we get started? Greetings, everyone. My name is Brian Eiler, and on behalf of Alan Bassiste, co-lead of the Mekong Dam Monitor, and myself, the other co-lead of the Mekong Dam Monitor, and the Mekong Dam Monitor team, I want to invite you to this and welcome you to this first seasonal briefing of Where's the Water? Mekong Dry Season 2022. And this is the first of a series that our team will do, inviting discussants and moderators and friends from the region to join us and talk about where the water is once each season of every year, the dry season and the wet season. But before we get too far, I have to thank our sponsors who have provided us resources for this event. And those are the United States Department of State, through the Mekong US Partnership, which provides core funding for the Mekong Dam Monitor, the Chino Siniega Foundation, and the Prudence Foundation, who are supporting our localization efforts. So the translations and interpretations that you're experiencing tonight are supported by those resources. You know, over the last year, data from the Mekong Dam Monitor has given us a clearer picture of what's been happening in the Mekong. And this all started really about 2 years ago with the Eyes on Earth report, the groundbreaking use of Eyes on Earth's natural flow model to show us when and for how long and to what degree China's upstream dams were impacting the gauge on the Mekong in Thailand. And this was groundbreaking work because previously the impacts of China's upstream dams were just a matter of speculation, although they had been happening. And what Eyes on Earth did was use a very novel approach to show us what those specific impacts were. And then about a year later, we launched the Mekong Dam Monitor with Eyes on Earth to use our own methods to look at 30 dams with our own tech. And we combined that with information provided by the government of Laos and the government of Thailand to feature how 45 dams throughout the entirety of the Mekong are changing natural flow of the river and impacting livelihoods along the river's course. And really importantly, we can't do our analysis without some of the best data out there in the Mekong, and that's data from the Mekong River Commission. And it's really with that data from the Mekong River Commission you've got over 100 years of data for some parts of the Mekong, plus the analysis and information provided by the Mekong Dam Monitor, that's allowing us to provide this clearer and clearer picture of what's happening in the Mekong Basin. So tonight we're going to have a conversation in 6 languages about what the data tells us and about the state of the river. And we're going to show you the monitor as we discuss, and perhaps through this, it will help you improve your own use of the Mekong Dam Monitor. And at least it's going to help you get better in tune with what's happening in the Mekong. And finally, much of what we discussed tonight is going to be new insight for many of you. Now, we don't have all the answers, but the Mekong Dam Monitor is providing critically important insight on what's happening to the Mekong and how the people of the Mekong can plan and adapt to changes in the Mekong River. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our program's deputy, Courtney Weatherby, for a quick round of housekeeping notes. Thanks.
Yes, so thank you everyone for joining. I'm looking forward to this discussion, hopefully as much as all of you are. And a few brief housekeeping notes. As Brian said, we've got six languages going right now, English, and then 5 of the lower Mekong languages. So I'll very briefly again share my screen, because for those who've joined a little bit late and missed it, we want to make sure you're able to get into the interpretation room. So if you want to listen in one of the local Mekong languages, all you need to do is look at the bottom of your screen where there's the globe and it says interpretation. And once you click that and select your language, it will bring you in and give you the audio in your local language. And that should be available throughout the entirety of the event today. When we move to the question and answer session at the end of the event, everything should be submitted through a written question to the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. It's the 2 chat bubbles, it says Q&A. And at any time during today's discussion, you can submit a question and our team will keep an eye on what's coming in and start raising those questions verbally. You can submit those questions in your local language and we'll use Google Translates to turn them into English. So if you want to submit a question because you're not comfortable asking in English, please don't let that stop you. We'll do our best to still answer all of the questions and make sure we provide clarity. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and let Sacheta really get started with our discussion. And we look forward to getting your questions and interacting with all of you later today. Oh, and you're muted, Sacheta.
Courtney, could you give us a quick introduction to who Sacheta is?
Yes, so Sacheta Han is joining us as our wonderful moderator today. I had the pleasure to meet her not only through her news coverage for the Mekong development issues, among others, but also because she was recently a data journalism fellow with the East-West Center, doing a lot of really data-driven qualitative analysis for Voice of America Khmer, and really sharing sort of what's going on with the Mekong in the world. So she has more than 7 years of experience working as a journalist in Cambodia. And for a lot of that, she's covered political, economic, environmental developments in the region and understands the importance of the Mekong. So Sacheta, I turn things over to your very capable hands and look forward to your leading our discussion.
Thanks, Courtney. Hello, everyone. So I'll give a brief introduction about Mekong River and then we'll start the discussion right away. So the Mekong River is one of the world's longest and largest river with more than 70 million people from 5 countries depend on this river for their livelihood through fishing and agriculture production. Noticeably, the Mekong River experiences low record flow with longer dry season and shorter wet season. This 2022, we are now entering the 4th year of prolonged drought, which are caused by a lack of rainfall in wet season and the regional low flow, unusual water fluctuation, and ongoing drought demand Mekong country to take a firm step. Our panelists here will shed the light on all the discussion and provide insightful information on the topic of the low level water of Mekong Basin. So here with us today, we have 4 panelists. One is Alan Basis, the president of Eye on Us and Mekong Dam Monitor Co-lead with almost 40 years experience working in climate science. We have Brian Eiler. He is the Stimson Center Southeast Asia Program Director and Mekong Dam Monitor Co-lead. He also is an author of the book Mighty Mekong, published in 2019. We have Courtney Weatherby. She is a Stimson Center Southeast Asia Program Deputy Director. Courtney research focus on sustainable infrastructure and energy development challenge in the Indo-Pacific. Last but not least, we have Nguyen Hieu Thien. He is an independent consultant based in Vietnam with more than 25 years of experience working on the issues of climate change, natural resource management, biodiversity, energy, and sustainable livelihood in Southeast Asia. Welcome, everyone. So let's start from something a bit general before diving into a more specific discussion. Ellen, first thing first, so where is the water and what are the main threats or concerns with Mekong River now? Your floor.
Thank you. And I'm happy to be part of this discussion and hoping we can share some of our insights with you and even more importantly, get some questions so that we can have a dialogue. But to answer your question, we have been using satellite observations to identify how the water is flowing or not flowing through the upper Mekong. And we've learned very clearly that the dams have the ability to hold back a tremendous amount of water. And of course, the time of the year to hold water in the reservoirs is during the wet season. So we're seeing it, as it was just explained, we're seeing a significant reduction of flow, sometimes even half of the flow or more that would be coming during the wet season from the upper Mekong is being held in the reservoir so that it can be released during the dry season. Of course, that is changing the natural rhythm in a river, the natural rhythm of the river in major ways. It's most pronounced at Tianjin, where the upper basin drops down into lower basin. And as more rivers come into the Mekong, the impact from China's dams are less significant. But still, what's happening in the lower basin is largely impacted by the major rivers and the major dams upstream and how it's altering the natural rhythm of the wet season flow coming into the lower basin. So I'll stop there. And we'll continue the discussion with other questions as well.
I want to jump in if I can and talk about some of the things that I'm watching with where's the water. On the Mekong Dam Monitor, I've shared a screen here, and Alan, feel free to comment, or anyone feel free to comment. This is on our homepage, a time series. It's really colorful. It's showing you the top 5 largest dams and the current status of how much water they have in their reservoirs. And the blue portion is the Shaowan Dam. It's the second largest dam in the entirety of the Mekong, second largest in China. The green is Norjiadu, the largest. It's one of the largest dams in the world. And you can see that, as Alan mentioned, during the wet season, they held back a lot of water. So the highest part of this line here, close to 40, is the maximum amount of water that was held back during that previous wet season. And you can also see that together those dams are beginning to release water, that the line's going down. It's kind of like a roller coaster. Now we're on the downhill portion of the roller coaster, and that water is beginning to be released into the Mekong. And just today we found a decrease in Shaowan's reservoir volume from 10 billion cubic kilometers of water, if you can imagine that, to 9.83. So it released about 400 million cubic meters of water. Alan, though, do you mind running us through what's happening at the kind of at the gauges that you watch at Chengsen and Vientiane?
Be happy to do that. And we've been watching it with the Mekong Dam Monitor for a couple of years now, or a year and a half to be more explicit. And we're seeing that what would naturally be flowing through at the current time is about normal, that we're in what we call the middle ground between the end of the wet season and the beginning of the dry season. So what tends to happen is that the blue line, the dark blue line, is what would be the natural flow, and the light blue line is what's actually measured by the MRC gauges. Excuse me. And we're seeing that they're very close to each other right now, that the dams have held back the water that they can. They're largely full. As Brian said, they can hold a tremendous amount of water, billions of cubic meters of water, and they fill up during the dry season so that they can use that water to produce hydroelectric during the dry season. So they hold the water in the wet season and they release it in the dry. And we're right now at the time when all that water has the potential energy for sending to cities in China to produce a tremendous amount of electricity to support the infrastructure, the production, and much of the industry in China. And so what we're seeing at Vientiane is we're seeing that over on the left, on the right-hand side, is that some of those dams in Laos are starting to release water. The light blue line is above the dark blue line, which means extra water is being released so that hydroelectric production can take place in Laos. And this is used by the Laos Society. Some of it's sold to Thailand. But we're about at the time when extra water is going to come out of these reservoirs for hydroelectric production for both China and the lower basin.
So I think in the coming weeks, we would expect to see that expected water level to rise and rise and rise. So river levels are going to go up. And that's one of the important messages that we want to get across for this dry season, that the river is not going to be getting lower and lower. Unfortunately, it's going to be getting higher and higher during the dry season as these dams release water. And I want to talk about two places that I'm going to watch during this dry season. And then ask Ken if he would like to talk about what he's watching in the Mekong Delta during this dry season. One place that I'm watching closely is the area along the Thai-Lao border, and how the Jinghong Dam, which is the closest dam in China to the lower Mekong, releases water suddenly or restricts water suddenly and causes not just a gradual rise of the river, but sudden shocks to the river level. So over last year, what you see here on these numbers here are 22 times when that upstream dam or dams even above Jinghong released sudden shocks of water to increase the level of the river more than 50 centimeters or half meter, and or decrease the level of the river more than 50 centimeters. And there were 4 times where it decreased the level of the river more than 1 meter. There were 2 times where it increased the level of the river more than 1 meter, and then sometimes in between. And this is really concerning. And perhaps if there are those on the line who are calling in from this part of the Mekong, they can tell us why they're particularly concerned about these sudden shocks. But one of my concerns is that birds nest and lay eggs alongside of the river's course naturally during the dry season, because the sandy banks are exposed. It's a perfect place for birds to find habitat. And these shocks, when they let a lot of water out of the dams upstream, they flood out the nests and they kill the eggs and therefore threaten these critically endangered species. So that's one thing I'm going to be watching as the dry season persists. Another thing that I'm watching is in Cambodia, from the Lao border to Stung Treng in northern Cambodia. There's a stretch of the river that is a Ramsar protected site. So this is an important wetland site. And there are islands in the middle of the river that are also important habitats for birds. So this is the white-shouldered ibis. It's a critically endangered species. And I was lucky enough to see this on a float down this part of the Mekong in 2018 with friends from IUCN and the local Wetlands Protection Agency. And one of the things that we saw was that trees that are in the middle of the river are dying and falling over. And these trees are important habitats. You can see the birds on those trees. And the reason why they're dying is that typically during the dry season, the roots of those trees are exposed for a really long time. And then during the wet season, they're flooded. Now they're flooded all year round because of higher river levels for the most part. And that's killing these trees, and their natural cycle of life is being interrupted. And with the trees go the habitat of these important species. And so does that critically important Ramsar wetland site be threatened. Tian, what about you? What are you watching in the Mekong? Then we'll get back to Sachita. What are you watching in the Mekong Delta?
Thanks, Brian. I think in the Mekong Delta, although we observe that the flow in the flood season is low this year as well, but in terms of drought and salinity intrusion, it doesn't look really severe this year as the previous dry season that we had. It's because we've learned through MDM project, we learned that the reservoir upstreams have been full. So the water is sitting there to be released in the dry season. So that water are going to push salinity out I think, do I have time here
Sure.
to make my points?
Sure,
Go ahead.
happy to hear it.
Okay. I think there's two things going on in the Mekong Basin. One is the abnormality of the weather, the happening of the La Nina and El Nino in the ENSO cycle. Some of the extreme events happen, resulting in extreme low rainfall and extreme high rainfall, and the shifting of the monsoon season. What we observe during the past several years, the shifting of the monsoon, the rainfall, to the second half of the wet season. And for the last 2 years, we saw La Nina happening starting in October. And the other things, the second factor in the Mekong Basin is the existence of the reservoir and the storage capacity. So I think that the three scenarios in a normal year with normal total annual precipitation rainfall, then the rule of thumb, the general rule is there's enough water in the basin, but the dams store some of the water and ship that from the dry season to the wet season, causing low water, reducing the peaks of the flood in the wet season and increase the flows in the dry season. And that is one positive impact in terms of salinity intrusion extent in the Mekong Delta.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh.
Okay.
Sorry.
We'll have another chance to see that.
Okay, let's move to the other question. Brian, correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like to me that the upstream dam benefit China through water restriction in the wet season, that they can release it for hydropower production in the dry season. How many dams has been built and how many are planned to be built along Mekong River?
That's a great question. Let me bring up a slide here to show this. Hang on. And I don't think I'm sharing my screen yet. Then I'll bring this back. So how many dams are currently built in the Mekong? I think we're going to see a picture of damming that's not just a picture of China. There are lots of dams built throughout the countries of the Mekong now, and actually the country with the most dams. And I don't, break apart hydropower dams from other types of dams. This is the broad definition of dams for irrigation or for water use or urban water. They're actually the most in Thailand currently that have been completed, 152, and most of those are small and used for irrigation purposes. China's got 129, 11 of the largest mainstream dams, 11 of the largest dams are actually in China. We're going to look at their storage here soon. Those are on the mainstream, but the rest are on tributaries. Laos has 68 dams completed, according to our look at the Mekong, and 37 more under construction. So that's over 100 locked into a future. Cambodia has a handful of dams in the basin, although Cambodia has postponed its plans for major mainstream dams. And Vietnam, you got to remember, is an upstream country too. So Vietnam has 78 dams, mostly small and medium sized in its portion of the Mekong in the Central Highlands. So it's not just a China issue and how China is operating its dams that's changing the nature of the river. However, let's look at the status of storage within the basin. So for these, the numbers that I just showed, here's by country, and these are the 45 dams that the Mekong Dam monitors every week. So we're looking at the largest dams. And when I say large dams, that's how much water they hold. Active storage is something like how the usable water that a dam uses, the amount of water that a dam can release or restrict. And dams are releasing water now during the dry season. They're going to restrict water again during the wet season. And you can see most of that water even though China has fewer dams than Laos, fewer large dams than Laos. Most of that water is in China, is being held back, 56% of that water. And most of it's actually in just two dams, the Shaowan Dam and the Norjiadu Dam. So to talk about how the effect that these dams have on the river system, we can kind of use the data from the Mekong Dam Monitor to think about how the amount of water that they store, that they restrict, would have flowed downstream. And again, this is one of the powers of the Mekong Dam Monitor. Alan, with the natural flow model, uses the natural flow model to imagine or to predict how much water would be in the river. We're going to do that too with this slide here. So I'm going to compare a high flow year, 2018. This was when annual flow of the Mekong was really high, to a low flow year, the lowest ever recorded in 2020. And what we're seeing is that during these 2 years, with the analysis provided by the Mekong Dam Monitor, those two largest dams in China, they basically held back the same amount of water during these 2 years. And however, during 2020, that amount of water actually meant a lot more to total flow, meaning that total flow would have been 9.3% higher if that water flowed down through the Mekong instead of being restricted in dams. And so when flow is low, like 2020, it's anomalously low, and that anomaly comes from a lack of rainfall. When dams are operating the same way as they would operate during the really high flow times like 2018, when they do it during the low flow times, it hurts even more. It takes a relatively larger amount of water out of the system. So this is in Stung Treng. This is way downstream in Cambodia, but let's think about parts closer to China. Now, this is that area that I told you that I'm going to be watching this dry season in Cheng Sen, up in the Golden Triangle along the Thai-Lao border. Flow in 2018 was high, but it was something like 60 cubic kilometers. The flow measured by the Mekong River Commission in 2020, again, was lower, about half of 2018. But again, those dams did the same thing. They restricted the same amount of water. So the flow at Cheng Sen, Thailand would have been 63% higher without those upstream restrictions. So again, during these really dry years, the way that dams are operated tend to hurt more, tend to impact the kind of the natural ecology, the resource provision, and the communities downstream, because they're taking a relatively larger amount of water out of the river. And that's one of the points we want to explore tonight is dams are kind of being operated the same way, regardless of the conditions downstream, regardless of whether the downstream is going through a drought or not. And this is very concerning to the Dam Monitor team.
Thank you, Brian. So it looks like the water is getting lower and lower due to the low rainfall in wet season and dam restriction. It seems that we all are experiencing longer dry season and shorter wet season. Can I say the combination of upstream dam construction and climate change have changed the river dynamic and its natural resource provision, and this is setting up Southeast Asia for potential disaster? Do you have any thought, or panelists?
This is Alan from Eyes on Earth. I would certainly say that the reservoirs and the dams are altering the pulse of the river that would naturally occur during the wet season. And that pulse is essential for the health and integrity of the fishing industry, particularly the heart of the Mekong fishing industry, which is in Tonle Sap Lake. And so we're seeing, you described it very well, we're seeing a combination of the water that would naturally pulse down being held so that it can be released for hydroelectric and during the dry season. But we're also seeing a huge impact from the lack of rainfall and snow melt that would be occurring during the wet season. How to explain that related to climate change, I think it was described very well by our panelists, that we've seen in the last several years a major reduction of rainfall, particularly early in the wet season. And then the monsoon that occurs is related to the heating of the Tibetan Plateau, which draws moisture in from the Indian Ocean and from the Pacific Ocean. And if you're not getting the heating and what we call a thermal low, drawing that moisture in from the ocean and promoting rainfall in the basin, then you're having a significant reduction in rainfall that would feed the river. So we're seeing a combination of these effects. And then I would add a third effect, which is also land use changes and irrigation, taking water out of the basin, taking groundwater away from feeding into the lakes and rivers, feeding into the Tonle Sap Lake. All of these have to be looked at as a contributor. So we need to start looking at climate change as one factor, land use change, reservoirs, and Brian said it very well. There needs to be, all these countries are dependent upon cooperation. And if they need to start looking at it as an integrated system, not just who can hold water back for purposes that affect and benefit their own country, but cooperation is key towards management. And so if one of the takeaways I would like to come out of this is promoting more communication, more cooperation, more understanding that we're in this together. And all the countries need to be figuring out how to effectively work together to maintain the integrity of the river.
Can I come in here, Suchita?
Yes, please.
I'd like to add that climate change already making it complicated, the system of the Mekong, but hydropower will make it even more complicated. In the context of climate change, we should expect extreme events like an extreme El Nino. We already had an extreme La Nina. And in case of the extreme El Nino, where precipitation rainfall is very low, then the hydropower dams do not have sufficient water depth to run their turbines. So the dams, the reservoir will have to close to accumulate water from upstream. And one dam closed, I mean, the minimum required water depth usually is 22, for example, meter. Then one dam closed, then the next one downstream will have to wait. Then that dam release water for intermittent generation. The second dam we have to wait, and the third dam we have to wait. The fourth dam we have to wait. So water passing through a cascade in case of an extreme event like that will take, I don't know, months. So there's no way in the Delta for us down here to cope with that, to adapt to that situation. The only way is to abandon that crop altogether. And I like to remind people that we've been talking too much about drought, but we should also not forget an extreme event on the other opposite. Extreme La Nina can happen in the basin and with a lot of water. And in that case, for safety reason, the dams will release water when the downstream already flooded. And that will create double flooding. I don't know what kind of disaster that's going to create for the people down here. For Phnom Penh, it's sitting right on the bank. And for us down here in the corridors of the rivers, the water will rush down here. I'll have some more, but later.
Thank you, Thien.
I'm afraid that Sotira will cut me, so I will cut myself.
Well, guys, and Courtney too. I've got a question that, that the low flows. Okay, so low flows have been experienced the last 3 years. Mekong River Commission data shows that very clearly. Mekong River Commission attributes that to a lack of rainfall. Now, I want to be clear that it's a lack of rainfall in the wet season, right? So the droughts are happening in the wet season. The dry season is a dry season. It typically doesn't rain. Most of the water coming into the system is actually a lot of it's coming from China, from snow melt. And it's the lack of rainfall, it's the lack of water in the wet season that is causing these droughts. Is it
lack of rainfall? I think lack of rainfall is one.
That's one.
The other thing
sure.
is the storage of.
Yeah, and they happen at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
making it
and
worse. Yeah.
making it worse. But is this lack of rainfall, is it normal? Is this a climate change effect? And how should we think about it? Do we have any definitive evidence on what's causing the low rainfall?
To interject here for a moment, as a climatologist, we certainly see that there's a signal for drier wet seasons. That has been obvious in the last 3, and now, as you say, the 4th year in a row. The climate models support that it will become more prominent. But I think the point that was just raised is extreme events. I'm not going to go too much into the physics of it, but climate change does not just talk about drought. It doesn't just talk about flooding. It talks about that the atmosphere has the ability to hold a lot more water when it's warmer. And that is, I guess, the key point I want to say here. So if the atmosphere can hold a lot more water, and then as was just said, there's a La Nina, then you can squeeze that water out and promote flooding. But equally, if the atmosphere can hold a lot more water and the water is not there during an El Nino, then the atmosphere is relatively dry. And so you're not going to be able to squeeze out the water. So climate change is not just in one direction. And the thing that we're noticing most is that the atmosphere's capacity to hold water is promoting more extreme events in both directions. So it's a key, this is fundamental, is that the countries need to use the climate signal and the reservoirs to help mitigate flood, but also need to cooperate when there's drought so that they can let the water flow so that the Mekong has some integrity left even under dry conditions.
We saw that through, 2020 was the lowest year on record. And if those upstream dams didn't hold back water during that lowest year on record of wet season flow, the flow would have been 11% higher and way far downstream. And that would have been beneficial. The extent that would have helped the Tonle Sap reversal, helped the Tonle Sap flood process, we don't know the answer to that question. It would have helped some. Specifically how much, we don't know. But what's being said about the coming wet season? What is there a prediction? Should we expect this next wet season to be as dry as last year and the year before? I don't have an answer.
I think with La Nina, I think that there's a better chance of getting more rainfall than what we've experienced in the last few years, because La Nina does promote more of the monsoon rainfalls. But I'll stop here and let other people interject their thoughts as to how that would predicted and how the dams and the regulation of the Mekong would use predictions about a higher wet season.
It seems like we have more questions rather than answer throughout our discussion. So there have been a lot of urging for China to share more data with lower Mekong country and more data sharing between the lower Mekong country. But can data sharing provide us a better outcome for Mekong, and how data sharing could help this?
I'll jump in with some initial thoughts here. And, I think when we look at sort of the history of water management in the Mekong, one of the primary challenges up until the last year was that there really wasn't much understanding of what was going on with China's dams. So, there's a lot of anecdotal conversation saying, well, we know generally speaking that dams hold water back, that they can change when water is flowing downstream. The impacts are clear close to the dams, but it's much more difficult to sort of understand what water is available. And I think sort of this lack of certainty, this black box aspect to what was going on with China's dam operations upstream made it sort of difficult for downstream countries to act on their concerns or their challenges. So for instance, if you look at 2016 and 2020 droughts, in both cases, you had countries downstream requesting that there be additional releases of water from China, but it was difficult because there was not much information about how much water is available. So I do think to the extent that the Mekong Dam Monitor has helped to shed light on, at least getting a general picture of what's available upstream, this provides downstream countries with a baseline understanding of what's available. And that can be used as a starting point for negotiations. It's very difficult to make a request when you have to make a broad request that's very vague and you can't ask for specifics. But when you can say, we've got at least some data indicating that there's X amount of water available in the reservoirs in China, we're starting to foresee an El Nino impact in the region, that provides an opportunity for negotiation. So I think data sharing is the first of many steps that need to happen. It's a key step. It's a vital step. You really can't have successful negotiations if people are starting on entirely different pages or even entirely different chapters of a book about what's available and what can be done. But that implementation aspect is really going to require coordination between all of the countries because there's different concerns. What are the red lines? What are the requests that are being made? Are we requesting changes to the operation of dams? Are we requesting that there's some sort of negotiation and what might trigger a process for releasing water that's available in the reservoirs to assist with drought downstream? When should those requests be identified? Can they be identified early before there's an emergency situation? And all of this has to sort of move beyond the data sharing and into a conversation about what can we do with the data now that it's there.
Thank you, Connie. We got some question in, but we'll talk more about this later. So if this crisis keep continuing, who will suffering the most from its consequences? What should be the quick step to mitigate the crisis, and what act can be implemented for the long run to reverse to the normal, or at least adjust to the new normal, or is this too late now?
Yeah, well, a new normal, I think it's too early to say that these low wet season flows are new normal. Again, like Alan said, that this year, coming wet season, we could see a big bounce back of rain, more rain. The river could bounce back, but this is just kind of an anomalous drought, but it's going to happen in the long-term climatology of the river. And you see these all over the world happening throughout the history of rivers. We just happen to be in that part of the Mekong's history right now. But things can change. For me, I think that obviously the downstream countries suffer the most. The Tonle Sap fishers suffer the most. You've got something like 2 million fishers that pull fish out of the Tonle Sap Lake and of the Mekong mainstream every year. And that gives them 70% of their animal protein intake and feeds the people of Cambodia. Those fisheries are at risk. And they're at risk because the high Mekong pulses are being brought down by upstream dam restrictions during these times of low flow. And also the dry season levels are increasing. And that's having a compounding effect on how the Tonle Sap Lake works. So I think that during these anomalously low flow years, we've shown how dam restrictions hurt even more. What dams should be doing, can be used to help, and they can be used to release water during these low wet seasons to provide assistance and relief downstream. And the easiest solution to that would be to engage China. Half of the storage is in 2 dams really in the Mekong, and they're in China. One dam owner owns those dams, and there's one government that oversees the operations of those dams. It's the kind of the easiest physical solution. It might even be the easiest economic solution, but because China hasn't come up with a cooperative plan with the downstream countries on how to respond in times of need like this, it might actually be the most difficult solution, but it is a solution. And I think there's one thing that has to be addressed is how you compensate China for releasing water during the wet season, right? Because they're foregoing, if they were to do this, forego releasing water during the dry season for hydropower production. And Alan and I were chatting about this today, and he actually has some ideas on how that compensation could come out, it could come forward.
Yeah, and I'll interject here and then hopefully move on to other questions as well. I come out of this as not as only as a climatologist, but I've worked for over a decade with the insurance industry. And this is one of the benefits of insurance, is to protect against extreme events, major losses. And the insurance industry, or specifically the reinsurance industry, could be collecting money from the lower basin and using those funds to basically offset the financial loss to China. So let's look at a simple example. There is a major drought year, and water, as Brian just showed us, a lot of water is being held in those reservoirs and not being allowed to flow naturally downstream. If a certain magnitude of a drought occurs, then all of a sudden the insurance industry says that it's a drought. And once a drought has been identified, then the insurance industry goes to China and says, we will pay you to release the water. We know that you will lose money because you're not able to sell the energy during the dry season, but that water is so critical and the drought is so severe that it's to everyone's advantage to let that water go and let those reservoirs feed the river downstream and maintain the integrity during a drought year. And those types of arrangements have been done in different parts of the world very successfully. So it can be, again, a cooperation among the countries that share the resources of the Mekong to work in a way that benefit the integrity of the river and the welfare of the communities that depend upon it.
Thank you. I'm sure we can keep this conversation go on for another hour easily, but we get some question in. So before we go to Q&A session, Courtney, can you give us some update on the status of plan Mekong mainstream dam and how countries in the Mekong are reacting to this plan? The floor is yours.
Yeah, so I want to be brief because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. So I think when we're talking about the status of mainstream dams, the key country to consider here really is Laos. We know that China is moving ahead with dam construction and there's very little that can be done to change that. Cambodia has sort of shelved its 2 projects for the interim, but Laos has 4 projects which have already gone through the Mekong River Commission review process. 2 of them, Pak Bang and Pak Lay, are sort of considered ready to go if a power purchase agreement can be signed. And the reason that these 4 dams are still not actively under construction right now is very specifically that there's not a market for the electricity that they produce ready to purchase that power. Thailand is sort of the key offtake market for Lao Power. And until Thailand signs a power purchase agreement for the electricity from those projects are still remaining in sort of a preparatory phase where there's a lot of work being done to get ready for construction, but the construction of a cofferdam hasn't yet started. And I do think that there's still some uncertainty there. There are definitely signs that Laos and Thailand are still negotiating and that Thailand could consider purchasing that power. But Thailand has a lot of extra electricity right now. And as we've all probably seen sort of with the global market, the energy market's changing very rapidly, and alternative projects like renewable energy, solar, including floating solar projects, are now increasingly an option. So I do think that there's still some space here to talk about what's going on and what has to happen in terms of dam construction and what is optional and what could be replaced with alternative energy sources. And our team was able to do some sort of alternative study recently looking at alternative scenarios and identify that it could actually be cheaper for Thailand to purchase power from tributary dams or floating solar or ground mount solar projects rather than from mainstream dams. So there really are still options on the table apart from mainstream dams that wouldn't have the same environmental and social impacts on the flow of the water, on fish, on sediment, but would still meet regional energy needs. And I'm more than happy to share that study. I can drop it in the chat. But I want to make sure we turn to the questions coming in from the audience because we've got 17 of them lined up here, and I know we're running low on time. So I'll turn things back over to Sacheta to start pulling questions from the Q&A.
Thank you, Courtney. Actually, we have touched on some point that we got from the Q&A box already. So I got actually 2 questions, but it just one. The question touched on international legal action. So one is there any kind of international agreement that would be fair to everybody, considering the overall effect in the system, especially toward the downstream country? And what international legal action can be taken against China and Laos for transboundary river transgression that cause ecosystem collapse? Do you have any thought, our speaker?
Well, a quick answer is that in the middle of January, the Mekong River Commission released a really useful report to kind of pin down what the main drivers of these strings of 3 low flow years were. And again, the answer was it's mostly rain, but dams are taking their effect too. And one of the things I learned from that was a lot about the Mekong Agreement, that the Mekong Agreement that the 4 lower Mekong countries are a party to, they all agreed to build dams on the Mekong mainstream that have flow guarantees that would guarantee kind of normal flow to the Tonle Sap. So the Tonle Sap Lake and its reversal and flooding process is built into the heart and the reason and the logic of the Mekong Agreement. And therefore, dams like the Sayaburi Dam and the Don Sahong Dam that are built, they have their impacts. They have their impacts to fish. They have their impacts to sediment for sure. But their hydrological impacts on the pulse of the river that creates the Tonle Sap reversal are minimal, if none. And because China's upstream dams aren't party to that 1995 Mekong Agreement, this is part of the problem. In fact, they're built to do exactly the opposite of what the Mekong Agreement is seeking to do. So it would be useful if China were to, if there's a talking point about international cooperation, you know, the Mekong Agreement is a central talking point, and the rules that are detailed in the Mekong Agreement will help promote more natural flow within the basin.
Also, we got some comment and question from participants. It seems like they do not agree with what Brian raised about compensate the China about releasing water to the downstream country. Do you have any response, Brian?
Well, I just think it's a reality that you know, for better or for worse, these large dams were built in China. They're there for a reason. There's a profit motive behind them. There are contracts and legal issues that say X amount of power has to be produced for X reasons. And when you ask somebody to stop doing that, you've got to give something in, you know, return. And I think the insurance option that Alan brought up is actually one of the cheapest and the most equitable options, because it's not necessarily the fishers of the Mekong that are paying. They're not putting up the cash for that. I mean, Alan, why is this a kind of a more economical option than other options out there?
One of the advantages is that they can do an assessment of the economic and the environmental cost and then adjust the payments so that it's in line with the impacts that would happen, so that China basically gets compensated for their lack of hydroelectric production, while the countries downstream get the benefit of maintaining the integrity of flow, particularly feeding the reversal to the Tonle Sap. So if you do basically a cost benefit, then the benefit far outweighs the cost of having such an insurance policy set up in advance. So it's planning, cooperation, looking at data, and then making decisions so that it's a benefit to all parties.
And importantly, you know, the downstream countries can do this too. The downstream countries, let's say China is not interested in releasing water during these low flow years to help the wet season downstream. The downstream countries have kind of some water in their hands in these dams to do the same thing. It's just a lot more complicated. Those dams are much smaller. There are many more dams. There are many more dam owners, a lot more contracts to deal with. And this is why I said that the simplest solution is to engage China for a solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Chita, just to be clear, we can go 5 minutes over time.
Thank you. I think this question we already addressed, but maybe the participant want further explanation. So So the question say, we all know along the problem of low water flood in the Mekong, but no solution to solve this problem. Can Mekong country and MOC talk with Chinese and country that build dam along the Mekong, like line cooperation in solving the problem or stop building dam? Do you have any answer to this?
I would say that the solution that we were just talking about is one of a set of possible solutions. The Mekong River Commission's January 13th report also talked about building large storage downstream in response to a kind of a new normal. I personally, I don't think that, I think there are too many dams already built in the Mekong. I think that they've done a lot of damage. Building more will even do more damage, particularly to fishing and farming. So I'm not a proponent of building more to solve the solutions. I'm curious, what do you think? Is building more infrastructure a good idea?
I think building more storage will further damage the systems of the Mekong Basin, because the reservoir is already there and store a lot of water to reduce the flood season, the disappearance of the flood season. And if you build more storage, then you're going to further take away the water available to the mainstream. So that will be more damaging. And I like to take this opportunity to point out that the impact of the dam's operations on the flood and drought is what we often talked about, but it's not the biggest impact. What is really killing the system is the redistribution of the flows. I mean, naturally, the Mekong River flows 80% in the flood season and 20% in the dry season, and that creates the system and the Mekong Delta because sediment transportation occur only with the strong currents. In the early flood season, flood months, July, August, and September, and now the flood seasons reduced, so transportation of the transport of sediment is reduced because the flow is not strong enough, and that will have immense implication on the geomorphology of the whole system and the disappearance of the Mekong Delta physically on the map in due course. I think that's the biggest one.
I think I would like to add to that. I think Tian just brought us excellent points that just so that the participants understand, water can carry sediments as a function of its the flow. So the faster the flow, the more sediments it can carry, and it's not linear either. The faster the flow, much higher sediment. And what's happening is these dams, whenever the water stops flowing, the water can no longer hold the sediments, and so the sediments are dropped in the reservoir, and the water comes out almost sediment-free at the dam. So the sediments are lost, and the flow is reduced, and that is impacting all the nutrient and all the sediment flow for the delta. And that is, as it says, the delta is being lost because all that sediment would naturally flow and feed the delta. You could see that with the Nile, you could see it with the Mississippi, you could see it with all the rivers. The deltas are fed by all those sediments. And if the water doesn't have the ability to bring the sediments down to the delta, that is basically having a severe impact on the integrity of the deltas and the quality of the populations that depend upon it, the quality of life of people that live in the delta.
Thank you, Alan. And my one last point is that the river signals going to be confusing for the entire ecosystem because the entire ecosystem of the Mekong, especially fish, migratory fish, depends on the fluctuation, the pulse of the flood for starting the life cycle activities such as migration. Also, the seasonality of the flows. The fish will be confused. Right. They don't know when to start migrating upstream to breed. And I think we can expect that the fishery of the Mekong, the wild capture fishery, going to be wiped out, and we should stop eating fish from now on.
Tien, that's a great point. This graph that I've been showing here kind of shows this, that the seasonality of the river is gone. This is at Pak Chom, so it's right in the middle of the Mekong system on the Thai Lao border, close to Vientiane. You can see the 2007 line, which is actually 2007 data all the way back to 1960. It's an average flow line. You can see that beautiful wet season pulse pushing through, and that's faster and more water the higher that blue line gets. But in recent years, the pulse is gone. It's just entirely gone. The seasonality of the river is gone, where we're seeing a set of low dry season flows. Now you're seeing some of the highest levels at Pak Chom happening in the dry season. And you're seeing some of the lowest flows at Pak Chom during the wet season. You'll see this at Cheng Sen. You don't see it so much, so clearly farther downstream. It gets more and more complicated. But those signals that used to happen in this part of the river, they're never going to happen again unless there is change in how those dams are operating.
I want to touch one question about Cambodia in particular. The question is, would one of the speakers address in some detail the flow reversal process in Tonle Sap River that refill the Great Lake of Cambodia? Maybe Brian, you want to answer this question?
Actually, Alan's been doing some research on the Tonle Sap lately. Alan, what do you think?
Well, it's a great question. And the Tonle Sap is the heart of the fisheries and in the Mekong River. And it was just said that the fish are confused. If the natural rhythm is a reversal into the Tonle Sap Lake, and it's not happening to the magnitude, and the flows are not occurring as would naturally happen without all these dams altering the natural rhythm of the river, then the Tonle Sap Lake is no longer getting the pulse of the larvae, and the fishing industry is severely impacted by that. The flooded forests where the hatcheries and the fisheries are supported, the flooded grasslands, all of that is being severely impacted. And we can see that the fishing industry on the Tonle Sap Lake is, I think, down around 40% compared to its long-term historical record. And so we need that natural pulse of the river feeding it. And also, I mean, Cambodia needs to realize that by irrigating tremendous amount of rice production during the dry season is taking water out of the lake also. So it's understanding how the ecology happens and how land use changes are altering the integrity of the ecology and the fishing industry. And then we need to look at the economic benefit and the social structure around the fishing industry and realize that you have to look at the cost of altering the natural rhythm of the river, as well as the short-term benefit from the dam operators.
I threw up some graphs here of the Tonle Sap flow change over the years. What we're seeing is that I think that Tien said it very well, that those late season weather effects are still happening, and it's driving the level of the Tonle Sap up. You're just not seeing it reach the heights that it used to reach, and it's rising or reversing, if you will, at much later times during the year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how much of that is due to upstream dam restrictions? Our team is getting closer to answering that question. And in fact, we will have that answer this year. It's a mission of ours to solve. You know, we're able to show the impacts of upstream dams at Stung Treng. That's getting much closer to the Tonle Sap. So we're getting down to kind of the heart of the natural resource base of the Mekong now, and being able to pinpoint specific impacts of dams in the Tonle Sap and the Mekong Delta.
We are running out of time. I'm sorry, everyone, but we have to conclude it now. Thank you to our excellent discussion, and thank everyone for joining us. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you. And I'll just note very briefly as well, I see we have 20 something questions we didn't get an answer to. Our team does have access to those questions, and I'll make sure we share them with everyone. So some of you who asked those questions might get an email or a note from us with some of the answers afterwards. But obviously this is a topic where there's a lot of interest in further discussion. So I think hopefully we'll see many of you again at the next time we do a seasonal readout conversation in our Where's the Water series. So with that, thank you all for joining. Reagan, could you end the call, please?